right now it seems overall there just isn't enough labor demand to reduce the unemployment rate very quickly. So those structural pockets may develop at some point as the recovery progresses, but we don't see those yet.
One place where you certainly aren't going to see it is in the public sector. I mean, the fiscal crisis, and we may get a chance to talk about that in a few weeks when we look at what the impact of the demographic change will have on state and local government, is that the downward pressure on wages simply because cities and towns don't have any money will be great. And it will show up as very small increases, possibly wage freezes, people taking unpaid days off, furloughs and so forth. And we'll also see, if you look at total compensation, that there'll probably be some shift in the cost, for instance, for health insurance, some changes in pensions, which will actually see, unfortunately, an overall flatness or even decline in the real wages of public employees in many states. Another question over here.
Much of the increase appears to be in the area of the social area.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of the jobs in the social area are quasi-government jobs. In other words, they're contracts that the government gives out to social agencies. And these jobs are ordinarily relatively low-paid jobs. Now, how is this going to impact on, the purchasing power and the money that's going into the economy?
Well, first of all, I would question your assumption.
Okay.
First of all, the largest growth, as you'll see, about 4 million of those social sector jobs, out of about 6 million or so, are going to be in healthcare and social services. Some of the social services are lower wage, but in the healthcare sector, you actually tend to have a higher wage on average, although you have brain surgeons at one end and you have orderlies at the other. But that should not put much downward pressure on wages there. The other area, though, is we also have a lot of government employees. And there we may see some decline in wages, although what happens in terms of the overall economy of the public sector is that, when we discussed this with the governor over the weekend, the new research shows, and it's kind of obvious, is that for lower skilled workers in the public sector, they seem to be doing better, and in some cases significantly better, than their private sector colleagues. So if you looked at those people, for instance, have an associate degree or less and working in kind of service jobs, the place you wanted to be until quite recently was the public sector. You do much better there. On the other hand, we get this twist because the public sector has a much flatter wage profile. So, the CEO of the state, the governor, I think makes something like $170,000. The CEO of, John Hancock is making 10 times that amount. And generally, managers in the public sector, college degree and above, are making less or no more than, and use often less, and the higher you go up in the hierarchy. Part of the problem is it's very difficult to attract people, particularly if they need a bigger income and can get it in the private sector, to attract them into the public sector.
Also, doesn't this mean that with the increase in the amount of healthcare people, that the cost of healthcare can't go down?
Well, the overall cost of healthcare is going to continue to rise. The question is at what rate? Today, if I got the latest numbers, we're spending about 16 to 17% of total gross domestic product on healthcare. That, by the way, is about double the average in the developed world, right? What's really going to drive the increase is these demographics, and we're going to see that. Let me give you an example. I just got the MEPS numbers, which is from the long longitudinal study that we're doing on medical expenses. The cost of somebody over age 65, the average cost in healthcare, is 3 times the cost of people under 65. And then if you take it to people 85 and above, it's like 6 times as high. Well, if you go back to my chart, where is all the growth in the population? It's over age 65. So we're going to see that tremendous increase. In fact, what we'll be doing, just to give you a hint, is we're going to be building a simulation model. Think of it as a big matrix, like a big Excel spreadsheet, in which each cell is going to be an age, race, gender, region-specific group. We also have another matrix, another Excel spreadsheet, which is the average cost of servicing those people. White males, 18 to 24, living in Massachusetts, right? We're going to now take that and we're going to simulate it out, move it out in time, and we're going to see several things happen. The age structure will change, the racial and ethnic composition will change. There'll also be some change in where people live, maybe more people in Nevada and fewer people in Massachusetts, relatively. We'll be able to also take into account the standard inflation rate, and we'll be able to project that out to, let's say, 2025. My guess, we haven't done it yet, is if nothing's done in terms of cost inflation, cost controls, we'll be up at somewhere between 23 and 25% of GDP just for healthcare, which means essentially no money for anything else. So the real question will not be whether we're going to lower the cost, right? And we're going to spend less. Our population is going to go up to over 400 million from 309 million in the next 30 years. The real question is, can we reduce the cost per capita? So instead of going up like this, it's going up like this. And that's going to mean redeploying the labor force in very different ways. Maybe using fewer physicians and more nurse practitioners. Finding ways of using community health centers rather than emergency rooms and Beth Israel and MGH. But that's what we're going to be looking at. And by the end of the semester, I'm hoping I might even have some data to give you that we're preparing for the bipartisan commission.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is that things potentially even more dismal. Because,
Oh, good.
Because over time, looking at the last few decades, even before the baby boomers started hitting the age where they're incurring major medical expenses, per capita spending on healthcare was growing faster than the rate of economic growth overall. So that's where we had this increasing share of GDP going to healthcare. Now, a lot of that was because of technological change. So it's in some ways, I guess in any way, it's a good thing because medicine made major advances. They could do a lot of things for us that weren't possible before, but those things are expensive. Now, the question I think going forward is technological change going to continue in a way that pushes up healthcare costs, beyond what you'd expect from demographic change? And, it can't, I guess there's, Herbstein's law is that unsustainable trends cannot be sustained. Is that something that effect?
Something that cannot go on won't.
And so this seems to apply to the situation because obviously if the share of GDP going to healthcare continues to go up because of technological change, it goes up forever, sooner or later more than 100% of GDP is going to healthcare. That can't happen. Laws of arithmetic are violated. Well before then, something has to change. But exactly when it'll change is uncertain. And I think when the CBO scores out kind of long-term budget situation projections for the federal government, they assume that for a while, healthcare costs will continue to go up because of technological change, and then at some point, that stops. And they assume it stops just because it can't go on. But no one's quite sure how that's going to stop.
Okay, Russ?
A highly speculative question. Let's set aside the sector that your speaker next week, Barry, will be talking about. What you call kind of the social sector, the government,
right,
nonprofit. That's kind of a domestic economy. The demand is domestic. The labor supply is domestic. But we're an increasingly global economy. And what I'm curious about, following on some of the questions relative to the wage effects and whatever, is there any economic data yet in terms of labor markets, particularly with respect to the wage effect within certain occupations? I'm thinking of some of the industries in Massachusetts, such that the wage effect begins to be somewhat more influenced by international labor market dynamics as opposed to historically just national or domestic labor market phenomena.
So are you saying, for instance, as we become more globalized, workers here are competing in greater numbers with people in other countries? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, but also I'm wondering if it could actually work favorably. For instance, for many years we know, in Massachusetts around Boston, there was a relative labor influx from countries overseas with people being educated here and then staying.
Right.
We know that phenomenon is rapidly declining. And in fact, it may be that growth in Asia and Latin America and other parts of the world may create demand for knowledge workers, labor workers in certain occupations, in certain sectors, virtually everywhere. And I'm
Right.
just wondering whether there's any evidence for that, such that the wage effect is not simply a function of US GDP growth and labor market dynamics, but could actually begin to be influenced by.
It already has. It's not, I mean, what is happening and where you see it is in the distribution of wages, not in the average.
Mhm.
And what you've
Right.
been seeing is a tremendous twist with returns to better educated workers rising, because there's actually a global increase, a worldwide increase in the demand for that kind of skilled labor. And we see it, there's this huge aberration called the Great Recession. But before that, you saw it, for instance, not that we were exporting Chevrolets. We weren't. We were exporting a lot of electronics, but we were exporting a lot of software, but we were also exporting financial services, insurance services, accounting services. My friends who work in these industries are flying all over the country, all over the world. And those take very skilled workers. The result was the demand for those skilled workers rose much faster than the demand for less skilled workers. And that partly, but only partly, explains the growing inequality that we have in the economy. There are about 9 other reasons for it, but that's one of them. Bob?
No, I agree. I think this is an area that's extremely controversial in economic research. So I think probably the dominant view is that most of the increase in wage inequality is because of technological change. Things like computerization, where now that increases demand for kind of very highly educated technical workers and decreases demand for the kind of manual skilled workers who previously would have been working on a factory floor. So that seems to be the #1 reason. I think everyone agrees that international trade has exacerbated that. Exactly how much it's exacerbated that is difficult to tell. Looking forward, one of the interesting questions is, are there some highly skilled occupations that could be subject to international competition or could be outsourced? And this is something that we're not quite sure what's going to happen. Some of the changes in telecommunications and decrease in the communication costs, the fast internet being available globally, allows some professional services actually to be outsourced abroad. So there's talk, say, of radiology being done in other countries because you can transmit huge files that you get from scanners, to a radiologist that's in a country where physicians work.
In Bangladesh.
Yeah. So I think so far, globalization has probably tended to hurt blue-collar workers, but that could be changing going forward.
It's a wonderful question. It's a little off the topic here, but last week, I don't know if you ever listened to Tom Ashbrook on WBUR, NPR, but I was on Tom's show last week, and it was all about rising inequality and the impact of inequality in developed countries on the quality of life. Because there's a new book out by 2 Brits, Wilkinson and Pickett, and I cannot quite remember the name of the book. It will come back to me in a minute. But their argument is, they're epidemiologists, they're statisticians who study healthcare, and they have come to the conclusions by looking at developed countries that the greater the inequality in the country, the worse health we have on any measure. Death, infant mortality, stress, medical conditions, long-term medical conditions, you name it. And of course, it's quite a controversial book.
And that's true even among the rich, isn't it?
Right.
Even among the rich. And I actually agree with the book for the most part, and I said, well, the reason for that is when you have tremendous inequality, right? Unlike Sweden, for example, or Norway, where I was last summer, right? Falling down into the bottom is really bad. Staying in the top is really important because the alternative is really lousy. And that puts tremendous pressure on rich people to stay there, right? And they do a whole lot of, stressful things, and then they flip over and do a whole bunch of illegal things. Madoff would be a good example of that, right? And so you could see why it would increase crime rates, it would increase stress, it would increase all kinds of stuff like ulcers, right? Heart attacks, strokes, and so forth. But before the show, Tom's an old friend of mine, I was saying I was thrilled to be invited to talk about inequality because I've written a lot of stuff. But my favorite article I've ever written, with also, I must say, with all due respect to vanity, the best title of anything I've ever written, was an article that came out in 1994. So we're talking 17 years ago. And there had been a big conference actually at the Federal Reserve Bank on what causes inequality. And you had all of these very smart economists who would then show up in the film Inside Job suggesting that this was all skill-biased technological change. It was inevitable because it was technology. And then you had a few people over on the kind of left saying, no, a lot of it had to do with free trade, right? And not having kind of international standards. And I looked at this because I had also written a book back in '88 with my late colleague Ben Harrison called The Great U-Turn, The Polarizing of America. And we had seen these U-turns where we had been going toward greater equality, and now we were going toward greater inequality. And it was soaring. It was going through the roof. And I'm trying to figure out, of all these explanations, what was right. And there were actually 10 different explanations for the growing inequality. Besides skill-biased technological change, the idea that highly skilled workers were getting huge wage increases and low-skilled workers in America weren't needed anymore because you could get that work done by Chinese or Indians. You also had this whole idea of trade, just trade having that impact. You also had deunionization. Unions were disappearing. You had deindustrialization. Manufacturing was disappearing, which had a much more equal distribution. You had these kind of winner-take-all markets, which meant that a few people get all the goodies, right? You had, I came up with 10 of them. And the name of the article was Murder on the Inequality Express. For those of you who know Agatha Christie and Hercule Poirot, she had one wonderful murder mystery which takes place on the Orient Express. Does anybody know the story? And what is the answer? What does Hercule Poirot find out about who murdered the guy on the train? Everybody. Everybody did it. And my answer is, all of these pointed-headed economists can debate till the cows come home whether it's A or B or C or D. The answer is anything that is becoming that unequal so quickly had to be due to a whole lot of bad things happening simultaneously. They all did it. And I still think, if not the article, the title. Because normally I write up, strange titles like, two-stage least square estimators in the presence of, ghouls. And this is just better. Another question? Yes, ma'am.
I'm really intrigued with your projections, looking out toward the future, and I'm hoping you're right. But employers tend to be pretty slow to change. They've got their setups, they've got their culture, they've got, the way you do it. So do you see any employers making changes that will accommodate older workers and what you do on the regulatory front? Since they also have to be very cautious.
So the question is, do I see any employers doing that? And yes, the answer is the ones that are going to survive. Right? The fact is that there's going to be tremendous pressure on them to figure out how to use this kind of new labor force, which has this much flatter age profile and has a lot of us old folks around. And those employers who can figure out how to use us most effectively will do better. It's interesting, one of the seminal works on discrimination was done by a guy named Gary Becker, who was at the University of Chicago. He's also the kind of father of so-called human capital theory. And Gary Becker looked at the whole question of discrimination. And he concluded that in a perfectly competitive market, discrimination would totally disappear. And here's the reason. If you have a perfectly competitive market where anybody who has a price that is slightly higher than somebody else gets none of the market, right? If you're charging $1.98 and somebody else is charging $1.97, you lose all the business. And he said, well, here if you have a company that will hire anybody, they've got this big supply, and that will keep wages from growing very fast. If you have a company which says, look, I only hire white men with blonde hair and blue eyes and who are over 6'2". The supply to that industry is very small, right? And therefore they're going to have to pay a premium for that labor. That will mean their price will be higher, and therefore they're out of business. Well, there are a lot of reasons why that doesn't exactly work out in the real world, But there's something to it. Part of the reason is we don't have those kind of competitive markets. But by extension, in an economy in which you have this rapidly aging workforce, and for a time being, a decade or so, you have this baby bust generation, the companies that are going to succeed the most are going to be the ones who somehow learn how to use that labor force. In the same way that today you've got companies who are learning how to use people in Bangladesh and India and China, right? Including Evergreen Solar, if you've watched the newspaper recently, right? So I think the answer is yes. There will be companies to do it, and they're going to be known as the ones that survive.
So an example of that would be some retail establishments now are allowing people to work in northern states during the summer and Florida during the winter. And basically it's in their interest to do that. So they allow the older workers who want to be snowbirds to move along with their customer base. And that's something that cuts costs for the firms to allow that. So it's a way of accommodating the older workers in a way that cuts the firm's costs. So that highlights, I think the firms will adapt, as Barry's saying, because it's in their self-interest to do so. But that also means that, as we look at this huge baby boom cohort that's going to be in the older worker group, firms are going to look to try to, utilize their services because it's going to be the cheapest way to get extra labor. And so people will be able to get jobs, but they may not be at really great wages. Again, because there's just going to be a lot of older people.
Yeah, but they'll have their Social Security, and next week we're going to approve Social Security will be there for me and you. We're going to worry about Medicare. That's not so cool. But
Medicaid too.
Medicaid, but that's not.
No, it's worse.
But all of us are going to be at Medicare someday, and probably earlier than we think, because if you're a state government employee, they're going to push you onto Medicare to get you off the rolls. But there is a flexibility there, and it's going to be who takes advantage of it, right? One or two more questions? Over here.
Okay, well, how about, there is a big X factor here, which, you're not discussing, and that is, the burgeoning deficit that our government is incurring. And I think, the way things are going, if that deficit grows too large, it should affect the entire economy. Now, the examples you show a relatively small amount of growth, and everybody says, well, if the economy grows, we'll get rid of the deficit. But right now, I can see in Congress, the Democrats don't have the courage to do what has to be done, and the Republicans are totally clueless on this thing. So
It's a good combination.
that's what we really have here. And
Yeah.
and how is this going to, how are we going to factor this in with all this that's going on?
Yeah. That strays a little off of today's topic, but let me take a crack at it. Maybe Bob does too, because after all, Bob sets world interest rates, and I don't.
All by myself.
All by yourself. I mean, one of the things that's going to happen is, one, we will have more rapid growth, and the size of the deficit, while it will continue to have deficits way into the future, the size of that deficit is going to go down and down and down. Number two, it's very clear that not only at the federal level, but even more so at the state and local level, governors, mayors, presidents now know you just can't spend and spend and spend. We see that, in good liberal governors like Deval Patrick and Andy Cuomo, and you see it in real conservative governors in other states. So we're going to see cuts in state and local spending, and certainly in Congress we're going to see it there. Ultimately, however, if we're really going to deal with it, we're going to have to think a little bit about raising some taxes. And the question is, what taxes are we going to raise? Here we talked about it. The governor was not really happy we did it at the Commonwealth Summit about we're going to have to raise gasoline taxes, right? So if we raise it 9 cents or 12 cents on top of $3.35, after a few weeks you won't even notice it. Number two, it's a tiny part. It's the same thing. People keep saying, God, our state taxes are so high. Well, they're not. But also, if you think about it, when you fill out your income tax on April 15th, do you really worry about how much income tax you're paying to the state after you send the check to the feds? Right? No. So we're going to have to raise some more tax revenue. What's really interesting is, if you go back to World War II, do you know what the marginal tax rate was in World War II?
90%.
91%.
Yeah, that was
And do you know what it was when John F. Kennedy was president?
70.
70. It's now 38. There's a big difference between 38 and 70.
35.
And I think, pardon?
It's 35.
35 now. And you know, with the alternative minimum tax, it comes up to about 38, I think. But let's not quibble over a few points. I mean, the fact is that there is room to raise some more revenue when we get gutsy enough to do it, or we get desperate enough. I actually don't worry as much about the deficit as other people do. I do think we have to be concerned about it. What I am very worried about is that when we decide that we're going to slam on the brakes between state, local, and federal spending, when we still have 9.4% unemployment rate. That doesn't make any sense at all. But everybody's drunk the Kool-Aid, right?
So I'd agree with you on the
Wow.
short term. That I think this consensus among economists, though they're, not everybody agree. Then the short term, the deficits, aren't a problem. It's something that the fiscal stimulus was really necessary to try to revive the economy. There is concern about the withdrawal of the stimulus over the next couple of years, what effect that's going to have, whether there's enough momentum to the recovery to keep going with the withdrawal of the fiscal stimulus. So I think most economists are on board with the stimulus was effective, it was needed. The deficits have run up partly because of stimulus, but even more so because of the drop in income, taxable income associated with the recession, would automatically produce a deficit. So tax revenues went down because of recession. The need for certain types of spending goes up automatically for things like unemployment compensation and some of the services. So that's where a good part of that deficit really wasn't avoidable. The stimulus was an add-on to that. That really did help to boost the recovery. Now, in the longer run, I'm more worried than Barry is, and that's because
It's because you're younger.
not that much younger.
A lot
I think I'm
younger.
just more of a warrior. And I think so while deficits now make sense economically, once the economy recovers and we're back to full employment, then the deficits don't make as much sense. Now, by the time we're back to full employment, we'll be hitting the stage where the cost of some of the big social insurance programs like Social Security and Medicare are starting to increase. So Social Security has actually been running a surplus for a long time. That's changing now. And so we'll be going from running a surplus that covers up some of the deficit in the rest of government to one that exacerbates the deficit in the rest of government. So as that happens, without changes in either the spending side or the revenue side, there are going to be deficits that just aren't sustainable over the long run. That would result in the debt to GDP ratio increasing indefinitely. That would not have good consequences. So I am worried about the political will. Sure, there's room for tax increases. Whether there is going to be, I think it's really a political question, whether there can be some sort of package put together that'll put us on a sound fiscal footing in the long run.
Yeah. I don't want to steal Professor Quinn's thunder for next week, but let me just hint that Social Security is not a problem. It's easily solved.
It is, I agree with
Right?
that.
Medicare, that's a problem. That's a real problem, and we're going to have to figure out what we're going to do about that. And that's why the bipartisan commission is really looking at it, and Medicaid.
The Social Security, it's not that big a problem to solve by itself, but it has been the case that it's been running a surplus. Some
Right.
people don't appreciate, and so the problem in the rest of government is bigger than one would
Right.
realize because Social Security has covered up some of it.
Yeah. But with a very small increase,
Yeah,
I don't
I
want to
agree.
steal thunder, on Social Security,
Yeah.
it's solvent for a long, long time to go. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Yeah, we'll give you another shot at it.
Okay, I'm older than you, so I
Really?
worry a lot about Medicare. Okay?
Okay.
Now, one of the things that it seems that we have a shortage in the future of younger people. It seems that this ties into the immigration issue.
Right?
That if we have more younger people coming into the country, it sort of balances off the older people.
Absolutely.
Especially if these younger people pay taxes. But this seems to be a real problem in terms of the political situation, at least for now and maybe the next 2 or 3 years. Do you have any insight into this?
I think what will happen as a result of the numbers I'm showing you is that we will have a new discussion about immigration within the next 2 or 3 years because we don't want to turn into Japan. And we'll be talking about that later. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.